Now you say that mysticism is rational, like science, and because it is, when you meditate or whatever, you're kind of, well, maybe objectively is a funny word to use in this context, but you're evaluating the nature of experience and so on and coming to conclusions. What about somebody who meditates and feels a very strong sense of connection with a personal God, or maybe a vague quasi-personal God or something? And why isn't that rational, or is it?
Right, right. Well, one distinction I just would like to bring up because it is relevant here. John Searle, I think, made a great distinction between subjective and objective in epistemological and ontological senses, so that you can be ontologically subjective in the sense that you are, the facts you're talking about really are subjective facts. They're not objective facts. You're talking about, what your dream looked like to you, but you can be objective in the way you talk about it epistemologically, which is to not make unfounded claims, to not be driven by, various biases. So I think we can talk about mystical experience objectively. I mean, it is subjectively, its status is subjective, but we can talk honestly and non-dogmatically and really empirically about it. And we do that inevitably in studying the mind, even in doing functional neuroimaging of various brain states. We have to incorporate people's self-report. A schizophrenic comes into the lab and says, "I'm hearing voices continuously." That is a subjective report about a person's phenomenology, and when you put that person in a brain scanner and find that their auditory cortex is activated inappropriately, and you correlate that with their report, you haven't made this more objective. I mean, this is science, but you're still using subjectivity as part of your apparatus.
You are, but I mean, ultimately, when you tell me that the subject-object duality collapses when you meditate, to me, all you're saying is this seems really true to me, and I got to take your word for it. And when somebody says, when I meditate, I feel contact with some sort of great being that exudes love or something, right, I'm taking their word for it. I mean,
but that one entails my claim is purely about the character of my experience. The other claim is metaphysics.
Well, but you ultimately reach metaphysical conclusions about the nature of consciousness and its connection to so-called objective reality.
Well, no, I'm not drawing any conclusions about the relationship of consciousness and the brain or what's true of the universe. I'm saying that this sense that we are separate from the sphere of our experience, that there's a thinker of our thoughts as opposed to just thoughts arising in consciousness, that sense is vulnerable to inquiry. And when you inquire in a certain way, that feeling actually disappears. But I'm not claiming that you can then conclude from that experience that there's just the one mind, of the universe, and you have merged with it, as many mystics do.
You then proceed on the assumption that you have found out something true about the actual nature of consciousness.
Yeah, well, as experience. I mean, for instance, I could tell you an experiment. This hasn't been done, to my knowledge, but I can tell you an experiment that would either make my claim seem plausible or not. And you couldn't use this experiment with the person who says, I'm in contact with God. I mean, if, for instance, we found the neural correlates of self-consciousness, so we got people in MRI scanners, and we made them self-conscious by telling them that people were looking at them. We could see your face now. We've got 100 people in the lab, and we're all looking at the pores on your nose, and you found some way of making self-conscious people feel exquisitely self-conscious in that context, right? And then you bring in meditators who say, well, I can lose my sense of self-consciousness. I know what it's like to be self-conscious, but you can stare at my face all you want. I can drop that, and I can tell you when I'm dropping it. I can tell you those intervals where I lost that feeling of self-consciousness. If we could find the neural locus of self-consciousness, we would see, brain-dependent changes or brain-correlated changes. And that could resolve, that could then make sense in the same way that a schizophrenic who says he's hearing voices, it makes sense when you see what's going on in the auditory cortex. It lends credence to his subjective claims. But you bring a Christian in there who says, I'm sure that Jesus was born of a virgin because I was sitting in prayer and I saw Jesus and I saw, I got the whole image that authenticated to me that the Bible is perfectly true in every word. You need not necessarily doubt the character of their experience, but the claims they're making about reality are completely unlinked to any empirical method you would use to authenticate those claims.
I mean, that's a somewhat more specific religion claim than I had in mind for the hypothetical person. But